Okay, so it is Monday, the 24th of April, our last full week of classes. Oh my goodness, we're here. It's pretty exciting. Okay, so just as a quick reminder, the previous slide we were talking about how the concentration gradient in the kidney itself is responsible for your ability to concentrate your urine. And so the concentration of solutes in the fluid, the interstitial fluid of the kidney itself gets higher and higher in concentration the closer to the middle or the medulla that you get, and that helps with the concentration process. So, and a neat little thing over here. Oh, it's in white, so you can't see if I draw in white. And so because of this medullary concentration gradient, much more concentrated in the medulla than the cortex, it allows you to really concentrate your urine. And note that within the medulla, the fluid in the tissue is more concentrated than salt water, or seawater actually. So if any of you swam in the ocean and accidentally swallowed, you know that there's definitely a lot of solutes in ocean water. High in salt. Okay, so more on this concentration gradient. Mechanisms that help maintain that concentration gradient. We have 5 mechanisms. You got to know those 5 mechanisms. So one of them we have talked about, or I've mentioned a bajillion times, is active transport of sodium. So you're using ATP, and then typically, because sodium is positive, chloride piggybacks on that active transport of sodium because it's negative and positive. So that's symporting. But you can also have potassium symport as well. Okay? And so this is in the thick portion of the loop of Henle, so you have to use energy to pump something out of the tube into the interstitial space of the kidney. Okay, the second mechanism, right here, impermeability in the thick, impermeability in the ascending loop of Henle to any water at all. Okay, no water can leave. Okay, you actively can transport sodium chloride, or passively, depending on if it's a thin or the thick segment, but absolutely no water can leave that ascending loop of Henle. Okay. Then you have the vasa recta, which is the blood supply to the medulla, and that helps reabsorb excess water and solutes you want to keep, okay, like maybe calcium, for example. Then you do also have active transport, and the biggest example we have talked about is the sodium, but there are other ions that are actively transported from the collecting ducts back into the interstitial fluid, which means that helps build up the concentration of solutes in that fluid in the medulla, which helps build up that really nice concentration gradient. Then the last one, urea cycling. This is where this happens in the collecting duct. You actually have urea, which is a waste product, actually diffuse out of the collecting duct into the interstitial space, into the interstitial fluid of the kidney itself, and that also helps maintain that higher concentration gradient within the deeper parts of the medulla. So those are very important 5 mechanisms to help maintain that. Now, we have talked about mechanisms of how we regulate water balance in our body before. We've talked about how ADH works and the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism before. So I'm going to just briefly kind of skim over that because you'll just need to review. Not only will it be on your exam Wednesday, but it could also pop up again next week on your final. So remember, you do get to bring in one 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper to your final exam. Okay. So regulating urine, the concentration and the volume of urine. So some very interesting things right here. So first of all, in the proximal convoluted tubule, the filtration, the reabsorption of fluid or solutes out of the proximal convoluted tubule stays pretty consistent. It stays constant. So that filtration in the proximal part doesn't change. However, reabsorption in the distal convoluted tubule, so your DCT, does change, and that is regulated. Okay, so the regulation happens more in the distal convoluted tubule. Okay, so forms of regulation, hormonal, which are the ADH, the renin, aldosterone, angiotensin. Those are the two. There's autoregulation, nervous system, and the sympathetic nervous system. If you have your phones out, guys, please put them away. So what can change the reabsorption rates in the distal convoluted tubule? Well, how much water you have in your body. Excess water or not enough water. Okay, so if you have excess water, well, your filtrate's going to be dilute, and you're going to want to get rid of that excess fluid so that your osmolality doesn't get out of balance. Okay, because you don't want to have a big change in concentration. Okay, if you don't have enough water, you need to conserve, and so then you have a lot of water that's being reabsorbed out of the nephron back into the blood supply. And then by doing that, it makes the urine much more concentrated. Okay, so the two mechanisms you need to review: the renin-angiotensin aldosterone mechanism, and there'll be a slide in the next one to remind you. And then the second is the antidiuretic hormone. Important key facts to remember is, what are they sensitive to? So, first of all, the renin-angiotensin aldosterone mechanism is sensitive to changes in blood pressure. Okay? That's what triggers that mechanism. The other mechanism, the antidiuretic hormone, is triggered by changes in your blood osmolality. Is there less solutes in that blood than normal, or are there more? So please remember what triggers either of these mechanisms. That is something you need to know. This goes through the whole process of the renin-angiotensin aldosterone mechanism again. So I'm not going to go into super detail because you've learned this before and you can review it again. One kind of new bit to this story is where specifically renin is actually made. So renin is made by the cells of the juxtaglomerular apparatus. So if you remember, that is a small portion of some cells in the afferent arteriole and then the cells of the macula densa. Those two combined make up the juxtaglomerular apparatus. And so if renin is produced in the kidney and it's released into the bloodstream, then it starts that whole cascade of reactions. Here's this picture I don't like as much. Let's see. Let me see. Where is the better? This is a better picture. Same mechanism, the renin-angiotensin aldosterone mechanism, starts in the kidney. Okay? So kidney, specifically your juxtaglomerular apparatus, I don't want to spell that. JMA. How about that for an abbreviation? That juxtaglomerular apparatus is going to secrete urine. Goes into the bloodstream. The first thing it does is that it causes angiotensinogen to be released from the liver. And then angiotensinogen is converted to angiotensin 1. And then in the lungs, it's converted to angiotensin 2 using an enzyme. Angiotensin 2 works on your adrenal glands. It tells your adrenal glands to release aldosterone. What does aldosterone do? Well, it has 3 major effects. It can affect the heart, affects the vessels, and then goes back and directly affects the kidney. Okay? So, for example, aldosterone would cause vasoconstriction, which would mean the vessels would, the diameter would decrease. And by doing that, it will cause an increase in your blood pressure. Okay? Another thing, aldosterone in the kidney directly affects sodium ion reabsorption, and it also affects how your heart is pumping the blood volume and the blood rate. So backing up real quick. So So angiotensin 2, sorry. Remember, is vasoconstricting, causes your blood pressure to increase. Aldosterone. Okay, another thing that aldosterone does, you didn't see on that slide, it makes you feel thirsty. So if you feel thirsty, then aldosterone is having that effect in your brain, telling you you need more water. And so you feel thirsty. Aldosterone, let's see. Also another effect of aldosterone, and it increases the transport of sodium across the membranes of the nephron. Okay, that's another major effect. And so what this does, the sodium is being transported out of the distal convoluted tubule and back into the blood. Okay, and by doing that, it makes the blood osmolality more concentrated, which then also triggers your osmoreceptors in your brain and in your heart that the concentration is too high, then to also continue to conserve water. Okay. Antidiuretic hormone. We've also gone over that, but now, what if we don't have antidiuretic hormone or not enough antidiuretic hormone? So first of all, lack of it increases how much urine you produce every day. Okay, so then you're really not able to control the urine volume. So lack of antidiuretic hormone can result in what we would call diabetes insipidus, different types of diabetes. So please remember this. Please put your phones away. I will take them and put them on the front counter if I see them again. Thank you. Okay, diabetes insipidus. First of all, diabetes refers to someone making a lot of urine. Insipidus means that it is clear and tasteless. So this means back before we had easy ways to test urine, if someone was suspected of having diabetes, the doctor would have to smell and taste the urine. Diabetes mellitus. Diabetes again means lots of urine production. Mellitus means sweet, honey, kind of sweet. So that is because there's a lot of glucose, because you're not producing enough insulin to take the sugar into the cells of your body. So then the urine, you're making lots of urine that is sweet to taste. So, yes, I just have to put this, got urine, yes, because that's what had to happen before modern medicine is you had to taste it. Isn't that great? Okay. A quick recap of the important points of antidiuretic hormones. So please remember the two types of diabetes, diabetes insipidus and diabetes mellitus. Okay? So some quick review of the antidiuretic hormone. It's secreted by your posterior pituitary, and if you remember, the posterior pituitary is directly connected to the nervous system. So antidiuretic hormone is a neurohormone. It is triggered when you have your osmoreceptor cells pick up a change in osmolarity. Okay, that means that maybe there's too much solutes in the blood or not enough solutes in the blood. So the two situations here, if osmolarity increases, which means the concentration of stuff in your blood gets higher, that's going to cause antidiuretic hormone to be secreted. Because now you want to conserve as much water as possible to help dilute all that stuff dissolved in the blood. Okay? On the other hand, if osmolarity decreases, which means basically your blood becomes more dilute, then you're going to stop producing antidiuretic hormone because you need to get rid of some extra fluid. And so that will increase your urine production. So if you inhibit ADH secretion, you increase urine. And if you do secrete antidiuretic hormone, that will decrease urine production. Okay. The antidiuretic hormone acts directly on the kidney in reabsorption or secretion of water. And the most important thing down here that is bold and italicized, antidiuretic hormone is more important in regulating blood osmolarity than blood pressure. And so the one that's important with blood pressure is your renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. Okay, two big differences. How does concentrated urine form? We've been talking about this. Let's see. We've already talked about filtrate all the way into the collecting duct. But what does antidiuretic hormone have to do with this formation? So, the distal convoluted tubule is the very end of the nephron, right before you go to the collecting duct. And the walls are very permeable to water. So what does antidiuretic hormone do? It increases the permeability because antidiuretic hormone is released to save more fluid, okay, to concentrate your urine. So if antidiuretic hormone increases the permeability in the distal convoluted tubule, that means more water can leave the distal convoluted tubule and re-enter the bloodstream. That helps you conserve more water than you normally would. So that is one direct effect of the antidiuretic hormone on the distal convoluted tubule. So more than normal, it increases the permeability of water to leave, and so you're conserving more water. And so then again, if no ADH is present, then the distal convoluted tubule is very low in permeability to water, which then means you are going to produce a lot of dilute urine. A lot, like this. Up to 20 to 30 liters of urine a day. So not having your posterior pituitary functioning properly and not releasing antidiuretic hormone when it needs to be could actually be very, very bad for you. Can you survive? What do you think? Can you survive if you're producing 20 to 30 liters of urine a day? You would get very dehydrated very quickly. I mean, that's serious stuff. Yeah, unless you're drinking more than that, you're going to have trouble. You need to go to the hospital for sure. Other hormones that have effect, we have also talked in the past about the atrial natriuretic hormone. So I'd encourage you to kind of do a quick review. The big things, the important things, so it is from the heart, okay? And what does the atrial natriuretic hormone do? It inhibits sodium reabsorption in the kidney. Okay, and then also inhibits antidiuretic hormone secretion. So if we're inhibiting antidiuretic hormone, we are not trying to conserve water, right? So we're inhibiting antidiuretic hormone. So when we do that, that means the volume of our urine is going to increase, and that means we're going to lose more fluid, so blood pressure will actually decrease. Which is not a bad thing because the original trigger was stretching in the heart itself. So too much blood volume. So if we get rid of some of that extra fluid, that will decrease our blood pressure, and then the heart will not be stretching as much because there's too much blood volume. Okay? I'm not too worried about prostaglandins and kinins, but atrial natriuretic hormone you definitely need to remember and be familiar with. Now, getting on to a little bit of anatomy, talking about the bladder and all that fun stuff. So you do have identification on your exam on Wednesday. It will be the exact picture that is here. It's a very simple picture, okay? And so just of the bladder, the major structures of the bladder. So it's a simple picture, so there's not a lot of structures to go with it, okay? So that will be the picture you will see on your exam. So, movement. Well, urine is made in where? Where's urine made? Kidneys. Okay. From there, the urine has to travel down these little tubes called the ureters to our bladder. And you guys, since we've opened up our minks, you've seen those little tiny ureters. They're much bigger in people. Carries that urine via peristalsis, not gravity. Peristalsis squeezes the form urine down into the bladder. And so I like this picture because we're kind of looking inside the bladder. These two little holes are where the ureters connect at the base of the bladder. And so the urine flows in from there, and then it's stored in the bladder. The bladder is made of smooth muscle. It is definitely a hollow structure, and it's lined with a type of epithelium, our transitional epithelium. Remember that? Made to stretch. Okay? That was a long time ago. We did talk about that. So layer of muscle, that's important for you to know. The smooth muscle that surrounds the bladder is called detrusor muscle. Okay? So you have the inner lining is your transitional epithelium, and then the muscular portion of the bladder is the detrusor muscle. So when you urinate, what's happening is this smooth muscle, the detrusor muscle, is contracting. It's smooth muscle, so it's involuntary. So this involves a reflex mechanism to urinate. Okay. So when it is time to urinate, urine is going to leave the bladder through the urethra. Okay? And the urethra has two sphincters. Well, it depends. If you're a male, you have two sphincters. If you're a female, you have one. So note that females do not have an internal urinary sphincter. The internal urinary sphincter is made of smooth muscle, so only males have that, which I kind of think's unfair, but, you know, that's how God did it. Okay, so only males have the internal sphincter. Males and females both have the external sphincter, which is skeletal muscle. You have control over the skeletal muscle. So males and females have the external urinary sphincter, and this is made up of the muscles of the pelvic floor. Okay? And depending on if you're male or female, the length of the urethra will be different, which we'll touch on a little bit more on Friday if we don't get to do it today on some of the main aspects of the reproductive system. Okay, so trigon is just, it's drawn in this, why do I keep changing my colors? It's drawn in this yellow yellow triangle for you to see, and it consists of the two ports of where the ureters enter the bladder, and then the exit port where the urine exits the bladder down to the urethra. That forms this triangle. Call it the trigon. Transitional epithelium, as a reminder, lines the inside of the bladder, and transitional epithelium is made to stretch. And your bladder can stretch quite a bit. So these cells have the ability to slide past each other so that you can have quite a bit of stretching. So the bladder is one of those organs that stretches and recoils and stretches and recoils. Important to remember. Okay. Change my color again. Urine flowing through the ureter. We've already kind of talked about urine filtrate formation and how there's a pressure gradient there. Yeah. Oh, it went off. I'm sorry. Thank you for letting me know. Okay, there we go. Okay. So the part I really want you to focus on in this slide is remembering that the ureters, first of all, they're lined with smooth muscle, and they move that urine down to the bladder with peristalsis, okay? So if you see a question that says the urine travels by gravity, that's so not true. Don't be tricked, okay? Urine leaves the kidney and travels down to the bladder by peristalsis, okay? Two important points right here. If we have stimulation from the parasympathetic division, it's going to increase how often peristalsis occurs, which means it's going to fill up your bladder faster. Okay? If you have sympathetic stimulation, it's the exact opposite. It's going to decrease how often peristalsis occurs, which means your bladder is going to fill up slower, which would make sense if we think about the sympathetic nervous system is that fight or flight response. You don't want to have to urinate in the middle of trying to save your life, or in the middle of event, whatever you're going through. Okay, the reflex that triggers the need to urinate is called the micturition reflex. And so first of all, notice the bladder can hold about 1 liter or 1 quart. A quart is 4 cups of water. Okay, so 4 cups is 8 ounces. So like a Nalgene full. So like Matthew's Nalgene right there, that's 4 cups. Your bladder can hold that much urine. Do you mind holding it up just for a second so that everyone can see and appreciate how much your bladder can hold? Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. So 3 reasons why your bladder can do this. Okay, so first of all, the bladder inside is very folded, just like the stomach is really folded, which allows it to expand to accommodate food. And so in the case of the bladder, with those extra folds, allows it to expand to accommodate urine. And then remembering number 2, transitional epithelium is specialized cells that slide past each other that allows more stretching. And then number 3, that smooth muscle wall made of the detrusor muscle also stretches. And note it says the wall stretches except for that area of the trigon, that triangle. Oops, I'm drawing a bad triangle. That triangle from where the 2 ureters enter and where urine leaves via the urethra. Okay, so more on the actual micturition reflex. So urine is slowly, constantly being collected in your bladder. And after you reach about 300 milliliters of fluid, then it triggers the micturition reflex. So until that point, you don't sense that there's any urine in your bladder. So this happens when the bladder wall begins to stretch. And so that triggers, so when it starts to stretch and accommodate more fluid, it triggers the micturition reflex. And this involves the spinal cord and parts of your brainstem and your brain itself. So it incorporates the entire, portions of the central nervous system, both the brain and the spinal cord. And so stretch receptors are what pick up on the bladder stretching because it's filling up with urine. And those stretch receptors send signals to the spinal cord. And so this picture here so the sacral cord, the sacral region of the spinal cord is where those stretch receptors send their signal. Receptors send the signal that the bladder is stretching, so the bladder is really like right here. So those stretch receptors send the signal over there and say, the bladder's filling up. It's time to empty it soon. So in response to the stretch receptor signal, those action potentials, then you have the response where parasympathetic nerve fibers are going to tell the detrusor muscle, which remember is the muscle that lines the bladder, and it is smooth muscle, tells it to contract. The bladder contracts down. Oh, I think you remember you all know what that feels like. You have your sphincters to control whether or not urine exits your body. But when the bladder is stretched and the muscles contracting, you have a very urgent urge to urinate. I'm sure you all know what I'm talking about. And so in addition to the detrusor muscle contracting down, trying to help force out that urine, you also have somatic motor action potentials. Remember, that's one division of the autonomic nervous system. It causes the external urinary sphincter to relax. So once you have your detrusor muscle contract, and then once your external urinary sphincter relaxes, then urination is going to occur. Sorry about that. So the last bit that is really important, I think a lot of people don't realize, is that you can't learn how to inhibit that micturition reflex until a child is 2 or 3 years of age, because it requires the development of the nervous system and the connection of neurons to actually allow this to occur. That's why babies need diapers. They literally can't control the micturition reflex, whereas you guys all can. So you feel the pressure, you know you got to go, you can control your sphincters, and then that's why people go use the restroom. But babies literally can't control it because the nervous system is not developed enough. So yes, people who try to potty train their kids way before that developmental stage are not going to be very successful. And just so you know, someday in the future when you're parents, it puts a lot of pressure on the kid if you try to potty train them too soon, and that will actually delay potty training because they really can't control it. Okay? So they can't inhibit that reflex until they're much older. So give me a second. We're going to start on our next chapter after I stop this.